The story. There is a kind of darkness that has nothing to do with the absence of light. Thomas Aldren knew this before he ever climbed down into the earth. He had grown up in the coal seams of County Durham, had spent his boyhood learning the language of deep rock, the groan of a stressed timber, the fine sifted whisper of loose chalk, the way a flame in a miner's lamp bends slightly toward a hidden pocket of gas long before the instruments register it. He had an understanding with the underground, a quiet respect, mutual and wordless. He had spent 20 years of his life below the surface, and he had come to believe that the earth's darkness was a known thing, a manageable thing, a darkness with rules. That understanding ended on the morning of October 14, 1917, at approximately 4 o'clock in the pre-dawn dark, somewhere beneath the Ypres salient. He was the third man through the breach. Let me explain what the 172nd Tunneling Company was doing there. By 1917, the Western Front had gone underground. Both sides had been digging since 1915. British companies, many of them recruited directly from the coal and tin mines of Wales, Cornwall, and Durham, burrowing beneath no man's land toward German positions. The work was exquisitely dangerous. Men dug by candlelight, by touch, in silence, praying the Germans weren't digging back toward them. They packed tunnels with ammonal explosive. They listened through clay walls for the sound of enemy picks. Sometimes they heard them. Sometimes they heard things that were not picks. The galleries, that is what they called the tunnels, were rarely more than 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. You crawled in and you crawled out, and in between you worked in a crouch with a short-handled spade, and you breathed air that tasted of chalk and old water and the compressed silence of the deep earth. The 172nd had been working a particular gallery for 11 days. Their objective was a German strongpoint near a ruined farmhouse the maps labeled as Grid Reference 7 Nora. They were to push a main gallery to within 40 yards of the German front line and pack it with 4,000 pounds of ammonal. Standard procedure. They had done it before. The record of their previous work was a series of craters in the Flemish mud that had been farming fields not 3 years earlier. On the 9th day of digging, Sapper Aldren noticed something wrong with the chalk. He described it in his diary, which was recovered in 1994 from a Ministry of Defense archive, along with 5 other items we will discuss in a moment, as a change in the quality of the dark. His words, not mine. He wrote, "The chalk feels older here. Not older the way deep rock is old, patient, mineral, dumb. Older the way a room feels old when no one has lived in it for a very long time. There is a heaviness to the air here that is not the heaviness of gas or damp. I have been breathing underground air for 20 years, and I know all its moods. This is something I have not encountered. The men ahead of me have stopped talking. I think they feel it too, though none of them are the type to say so." He mentioned it to his section corporal, a man named Briggs. Briggs told him to shut up and keep digging. On the 10th day, the gallery pierced something. Not earth, not chalk, not clay, a wall. It was masonry. Fitted stone, not brick, not poured, assembled with a precision that none of the men had seen before. There were no mortar lines visible. The stones were dressed to such fine tolerances that a bayonet blade could not be inserted between them. Aldren ran his hands across the surface in the dark and described the sensation in his diary as touching the face of a clock that has been stopped for a very long time. He was 23 years old. He had the soul of a poet and the hands of a collier, and 3 months later he would never write another word about anything. But that comes later.
The lieutenant, a man named Forrest, fresh from officer training, already showing the gray eyes of someone who had aged a decade and 4 months on the salient, ordered the wall investigated before any advance was made. He was meticulous in the way of a man who understood that carelessness underground was a death sentence. He sent a runner back to battalion headquarters with a note describing the discovery. He had the men widen the gallery around the penetration point and shore it with fresh timber. He had Sapper crew, who had been a surveyor in civilian life and retained some of that professional precision, even after everything the salient had done to him, take compass readings and check them against the gallery maps. What crew found was that the wall should not exist at any depth. They were 40 feet below the surface. The German lines were still 80 yards ahead. No Allied or German engineer had reported any structure in this sector. The geological survey, the same survey the tunneling companies used to plan their work, showed nothing but natural chalk and clay at this depth for the entire grid square. There were no Roman fortifications in this region, no medieval cellar complex, no crypt, no documented underground structure of any kind. The wall existed, and it had no place on any map, and it had no business being there, and yet there it was, smooth and patient and cold beneath Aldren's hands. Lieutenant Forrest sent another runner, this time requesting a senior officer attend. No senior officer came that day. They came the following morning, a Captain Harwood from the Royal Engineers Special Survey Section, a unit most of the men had never heard of. He was accompanied by 2 men in officers' uniforms who carried no visible rank insignia, who spoke to no one, who examined the wall with small electric torches for 20 minutes, running the light carefully across every accessible surface, and then conferred privately with Forrest for a further 10. Whatever was said in that conference, Forrest returned looking like a man who had been handed a bill for something he could not afford. He ordered the gallery section widened. He ordered a timber frame constructed around the penetration point for structural support. And then, quietly, at the end, he ordered the wall opened. It took 4 hours. The masonry was not just dense, it was assembled in a pattern that resisted conventional removal. Pulling one stone did not free adjacent stones. There appeared to be a load-bearing logic to the structure that operated on principles none of the miners could intuit from their experience with ordinary construction. Every stone seemed to brace the ones around it. In the end, they used a crowbar and brute repetition, working methodically inward, and by 2 in the morning of October 14th, they had opened a gap 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Cold air came through it. This is the detail that Aldren returned to again and again in subsequent diary entries and in the partial debrief transcript recovered with his papers. Not cold air in the way of a sealed cellar, not the musty cold of a space that has been closed for years, laced with the smell of old stone and standing water. Cold air that was clean, impossibly, wrongly clean. He wrote, "It smelled of nothing, not of earth, not of rot, not of gas, of absolutely nothing, like breathing the air from a jar that has been sealed since before I was born." I stood at the breach for perhaps half a minute before I went through, and I was breathing, and there was no smell at all, and that frightened me more than anything I have encountered since I came to France, though I could not have told you why. Lieutenant Forrest went through first with an electric torch, then Corporal Briggs, then Sapper Aldren. The 2 men with no rank insignia followed. What they found was a single chamber, roughly oval, approximately 30 feet in length and 15 in width at its widest point. The ceiling was arched, the same fitted masonry as the wall, perfectly maintained after however many centuries it had been down here, unbowed by the weight of 40 feet of earth above it. The floor was stone flags, level and tight-jointed. The gallery the men had cut into the wall was the only entrance. There were no other doors, no passages, no openings. The chamber had been, before they arrived, completely hermetically sealed. And the chamber was empty, completely, absolutely empty, except for the table. It sat in the center of the chamber. Stone like everything else, the same gray limestone as the walls, but roughly hewn compared to the elegant masonry around it, as if it had been made by different hands, or at a different time, or in a different state of mind. A functional piece of furniture, by necessity rather than craftsmanship. And on the table, this is the part of the diary where Aldren's handwriting begins slightly to deteriorate, were 8 objects arranged in a line from left to right, evenly spaced, oriented with the careful precision of a display. He described them in order. A glass vessel, sealed with a wax cap, containing something dark that was not liquid and not solid, but that moved very slowly when the torchlight crossed it. Not the movement of a liquid disturbed, but the movement of something that responds to light. A folded piece of material that resembled leather, but which Corporal Briggs picked up and immediately put back down, saying only that it felt like nothing he had ever touched, and that he did not want to hold it any longer. A small iron device of unclear purpose with 3 articulated arms, each terminating in a hook, locked in a position that suggested they had been stopped from completing a rotation, frozen mid-turn by some force that had not been removed but had simply outlasted the momentum. 4 objects that Aldren described only as items I cannot describe adequately with words I know. He returned to this phrase twice in subsequent diary entries, not because he had forgotten, he wrote, but because the words that existed did not map correctly onto the things. The shapes were wrong. The materials were wrong. He was a man of considerable intelligence and broad reading, and he had no reference. And at the far right end of the line, a human hand, severed at the wrist, desiccated to black leather over bone, ancient in the way of Egyptian mummies or bog bodies, the fingers curved and positioned with the precision of something that had been deliberately arranged. The hand was pointing. The index finger was extended. It pointed toward the east wall of the chamber. Aldren wrote, I looked at the east wall. In the light of Forrest's torch, I could see it clearly. There were marks on it. I will describe what they looked like. They were not carvings, not inscriptions, not decorative. They were marks made by something pressing against the stone repeatedly in the same places over a very long period of time. They were the marks of something that had been at the wall and had wanted very badly to get through it, and that had worked toward that end with a patience that I cannot conceive of. That is where the descriptions become fragmentary.
What we know from the debrief transcript, which runs to 4 pages, of which 2 are entirely redacted, is that Sapper Aldren was the only member of the original entry party who returned from the chamber under his own power. Lieutenant Forrest was carried out unconscious and was evacuated to a casualty clearing station, where he died 11 days later from causes the medical officer listed as cardiac failure. His family disputed this diagnosis for years and never received a satisfactory explanation. He was 26 years old and had no history of cardiac disease. Corporal Briggs was found sitting against the far wall of the gallery the following morning, at the point furthest from the breach, with both hands pressed flat against his thighs, staring at the middle distance, unresponsive to voice or touch. He had to be physically extracted by 2 men. He did not speak again for 6 weeks, and when he finally did speak in the casualty clearing station at Popperinge, it was exclusively in a language no one present could identify. Not German, not French, not any language the medical staff had encountered. He was evacuated to England. His subsequent record is sealed. The 2 men without rank insignia were not mentioned in any subsequent paperwork. Aldren's own debrief ran to 8 pages. 6 are redacted. What remains is an intake description. His name, rank, number, physical condition on emergence, noted as disoriented and unresponsive to standard questions, and a single paragraph at the very end, which reads as follows, in its entirety. Sapper Aldren states that the chamber contained evidence of habitation of recent date. He states that the objects on the table had been disturbed from a previous arrangement before the entry party arrived. He states that he heard movement in the chamber during the period following entry that he could not attribute to any member of the entry party. He states that he does not know what made the marks on the east wall. He requests in the strongest possible terms that the chamber be sealed immediately and permanently, and that no further personnel be sent inside under any circumstances. The gallery was collapsed by controlled demolition on October 16, 1917. The official record attributes this to a decision to redirect tunneling resources elsewhere in the sector. There is no further documentation in the operational record. No subsequent mention of Gallery 7 Nora in any surviving paperwork of the 172nd Tunneling Company. No explanation is offered, however, for why the demolition charge used was 7 times larger than standard practice for a gallery collapse of that length. Standard practice for sealing a gallery of this type required 40 pounds of ammonol. The charge laid on October 16th was 280 pounds. There is a brief note in the demolition log, in handwriting that does not match any known member of the 172nd, which reads, "Ensure complete. No partial collapse acceptable." Thomas Aldren survived the war. He returned to County Durham and worked the coal mines until 1931, when a fall put him on the surface for good. He kept his diary through all of it. He continued writing in it until 1950. The entries after October 14, 1917 are sparse, a few lines per week, recording weather, work, the names of men he knew who died. He mentions the salient rarely, and the chamber only once more, in an entry from March 1923. He writes, "I have not forgotten what was on the east wall. I think about it on most nights when the house is quiet and there is no sound but the settling of the walls. I think about the fact that the marks were fresh. They were not ancient. They had been made recently, within weeks, I believe, based on the quality of the stone dust at their edges.
Something had been at that wall very recently before we arrived. And I think about the cold air and how it smelled of nothing at all, as if everything organic had been systematically removed from it. I think about how, when I was the last man out, and I turned back with my torch before squeezing through the breach, just a single sweep of the light. One last look. The table was empty.